program, and somebody who even wrote about the topic of civil-military relations. And I just want to welcome you on behalf of the school to Bridging America's Civil-Military Divide. This is really it's a remarkable program. I want to thank our sponsors, which include the Hopkins Stavros Niarchos Agora Institute, which is an institute dedicated to kind of the study of the civil space and of liberal democracy. The Foreign Policy Institute's The Big Picture Initiative, which is spearheaded by Shamila Chowdhury, who I'll say more about in a moment, and the Philip Merrill Center for Strategic Studies. The two people who put this together are Professor Mara Karlin, the new warlord of the Strategic Studies program at SAIS, who has a distinguished record in both in academe, books, articles, and so on, but also in public service in the Department of Defense. And Shamila Chowdhury, who's the senior advisor to Dean Vali Nasser, who also has a distinguished career in public service in the State Department for about a decade or so. And they'll be taking you through this. I have to say, you know, I look at this program, and it is really quite extraordinary. We have people who have been at very senior levels of policymaking, like my friend Eric Edelman, general officers like General Ham, who it's great to welcome you, sir, current students, journalists like Greg Jaffe, really the full range, and the full range of discussions, including culminating in what I think will be a spectacular event tonight, a dramatic reading of parts of Sophocles Ajax by the Theater of War. So this will be a remarkable day. I regret that I will be kind of dropping in and out. That's because I have to deliver bad news about budgets to people. That's what deans do. But I'll be with you for part of this in body and for all of it in spirit. So really, Shamila and Mara, thank you for putting this on. And without any further ado, I'm going to step off the stage and let you folks take charge. Welcome.
Thank you all so much for being here today. I'm really looking forward to this day of discussions and dialogue on civil-military relations. I often think there's sort of two thrusts to this topic. So the one thrust is those of us who live in the national security community. And we confront the issue of civil-military relations and dynamics indirectly every day in every topic that we think about. And so the first panel is really going to hit that piece pretty hard. The second panel is really going to hit the other bucket, which is what does it mean to be a citizen and what does it mean to serve? And we have, we've seen now where you've got about 0.5% of Americans who serve in the military, where it has increasingly become a family business with the all-volunteer force. You see this real divide that has grown between those who serve and those who don't. And so what we're going to do with this second panel, we're going to start a conversation. We will have some students and faculty. I note that I don't remember the last time that I've seen students up on this stage, so I'm particularly excited that we're going to bring some students up to talk. And they're going to talk about why they joined the military. They'll talk about what it has meant to be in the military, and for those who've retired, what it meant to leave the military. We're at this sort of interesting moment in American history where it's gotten a whole lot easier to put the military on a pedestal than to really think through the issues of those who are a part of it. And so I hope we'll be able to have that conversation. Shamila will talk about a great photo exhibit that's coming up. Elliot already mentioned the Theater of War exhibit. So really, I just wanted to say thanks for coming. It's 2019. The U.S. military has been at war for 18 years. And yet we regularly keep hearing, hey, we might go to war. So it seems to me today's a good day to start thinking about those issues. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to SAIS. And I see lots of familiar faces in the audience as well, so thanks for coming back. So let me tell you why we're doing this today. We're having panels, we're having theater, and we're combining that with photojournalism. It's kind of an unusual and special event to have at SAIS. And it started with a conversation with myself and Mara, and basically I, like many of you, started off being very interested in the world and wanting to travel the world, work on policy, make a difference. And so I started learning languages, I learned history, I wanted to travel and do internships overseas, and I did all of that. And all of that landed me in the US government, which was wonderful, a very enriching, fruitful experience. I got to work at the State Department, at the White House, and I know many of you will relate to this. Then instantly my world became smaller and smaller and smaller. And I learned in some ways less about the stories and experiences of people that we were working on. And so, I got to work at the White House in Afghanistan and Pakistan, did the same thing at the State Department, and I feel like I worked on some of the most challenging issues of our time, and they dealt with those that we put into combat. However, in my experience, I was not at DOD, I was not in the field, I was in Washington. I felt very isolated from that community that was, we were putting at risk. I didn't feel connected to them, even when I got to the White House. And I don't expect everyone else to have the same experience, but I felt very strongly about it because I knew there was something else on the other side, because I was actually trained to think about the Afghans and the Pakistanis. And in that training, I forgot about the Americans. And it took me a long time to realize that. It took me leaving government to really understand that. And I felt like I started to relearn what it means to work on foreign policy, what it means to know a country, to know what our interest means, to know people. And I did all of that outside of policy work. I watched films like Restrepo. I followed the work of photojournalists who had spent many years in the field, putting their own lives at risk. And I retrained my brain to better understand the stories of people that we put at risk every day with our decision making and our national interest. So I've been having these conversations with Mara, who's an excellent colleague to work with, and this is amazing. We've been working on this for the past year, this project. So it's wonderful to see it come to fruition. And we thought we had to bring this to this wonderful platform we have, which combines students, faculty, staff, and practitioners, and those who served. So that's really the kind of the motivation for what we did today. And I hope you'll get a chance to participate both in the panels and also take a look at the exhibit, which is looking at a community of veterans in the Lakota Nation that is completely invisible to all of us. But I think in that you'll find a lot of similarities with our own experiences and the stories that we're going to talk about of veterans and what they deal with when they come back in this broader context of the civil-military divide. So with that, I just want to say issue a very warm welcome. Dean Nasser couldn't be here today. He's traveling to Asia, but he very much supports this issue and this event, and I look forward to hearing everyone's very interesting views today. Thank you. And I will turn it over to Mara now, right? You wanna, okay.
Thanks for everybody's attention here. And before we get started, why don't you guys just go down the line and give everybody just a quick summary of your experience, what you bring to this. We're going to be primarily talking about civil-military relations, I think, with regard to sort of how policy is made, how we put troops at risk, how we decide on missions, how we prioritize resources, all the things out in the field. But give everybody a quick 60-second summary of your background.
Sure, I'm Eric Edelman. No, I'm not Eric Edelman.
I was going to say, wait a minute.
Yeah. I'm Kathleen Hicks. I spent in two major segments over 17 years in the Defense Department. I left the Defense Department as the Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Policy. And I currently am the Senior Vice President, Henry Kissinger Chair, and Director of the International Security Program across the way at CSIS.
I am Eric Edelman, and I'm a lapsed diplomat, but spent actually one of the largest chunks of my Foreign Service career, 2 tours, 6.5 years in the Department of Defense, a factoid that I love to torment my former Foreign Service colleagues like Dan Server and Mort Dworkin, who are sitting in the audience with. And I also had the great good fortune of working there with the other two panelists today, with Kath and with General Carter Ham.
I'm Carter Ham, retired Army officer. My last assignment was as Commander, United States Africa Command. And relevant to this topic, I was civil military affairs didn't matter much to me until pretty late in my career, and service in Iraq, and then later at the Pentagon in the Directorate for Operations. That kind of brings together some of the issues I suspect that we'll talk about. And today I serve as the president at the Association of the United States Army across the river in Arlington.
Great. I'm Greg Jaffe, reporter with the Washington Post, and we'll launch into it. I'm going to start at the most basic level, and then we'll work our way up. And I'd like to hear all three of you guys sort of discuss this. As a reporter, you know, I run into the lieutenant colonel or colonel fresh out of War College, and his view of the way policy is made is, you know, those damn civilians just need to give us a clear end state and let us execute. And they never do. And it's always the civilians' fault. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about what is that dedicated lieutenant colonel or colonel missing? What's realistic? And if that's a lousy way to think about it, what's a better way to think about it?
Would you like me to start?
Yeah, go right ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think too bad Elliot Cohen walked out of the room, because I think his unequal dialogue is the perfect way to capture the reality of the civil-military conversation and decision-making process around issues of use of force in particular, which I think is the thrust of what the panel is going to focus on here. So the reality is often you will get some kind of an end state, not always, and then that begins the dialogue, and then the decision maker may hear, civilian decision maker may hear, okay, this is kind of what the parameters are that would make that a success, and that causes, as it should, a conversation around whether that's really the right way to do it, and it's an ongoing dialogue. That works very well when there's trust. When trust breaks down, it's a disaster, because everyone is gaming the system from the beginning. The civilians are gaming what they want to ask because they don't want answers that are politically challenging or that get into the news cycle in ways that aren't helpful. The military side might be quite concerned that the civilians have no idea what they're doing or asking about, so they might game their answers, so that the question isn't asked again or is asked in a very particular way. And that's the reality for many of us who've lived it, is really more than anything about trying to build the trust level so that you have a true conversation that ultimately results appropriately in the civilians making a decision well-informed by military advice alongside a lot of other kinds of advice.
Eric, can you talk a little bit about how you build that trust too?
I think that, and Kath and I and Mara were talking about this before the panel began, and I'd be very interested in General Ham's view of this, because I think it was the case when he was in the J3 and John Sattler was my partner in the J5 and we were working in the Pentagon together. I think it begins with a recognition, which the anonymous lieutenant colonel who you were describing probably lacks the experience to realize that at the most senior level, the issues that policymakers are called upon to deal with are a mix of political and military. And that at that level, the lines between what is purely military advice and what is policy advice are, to say the least, very blurry. And I think if people insist, and this is my lane, that's your lane, it's not going to work very well. If you have people who are working together to try and accomplish an objective, and have just fundamental respect for each other, for what their respective independent experiences bring to the table on the subject, then I think you can get a lot done, and you can work in pretty good harmony. I mean, I can think of one very specific example just to illustrate this. General Sattler and I were asked at one point to be part of an interagency group that Dean Cohen was also asked to be a member of. After we got intelligence about the creation of the nuclear reactor that was being built in the western Syrian desert at El Kabar. And the number of people who were involved in that was very small. I mean, it was literally personally selected by the president. We had an interagency process in which there were no leaks, in which John and I worked very, very closely together. And I had an enormous amount of respect for John and what he had accomplished when he was out in Iraq and what he had done at the Battle of Fallujah. And I think, I mean, John's not here to say, but I think he had a fair amount of respect for what I had done when I was an ambassador in Turkey, adjacent to General Ham, because he was down just south of my border and right on the cusp of the EUCOM-CENTCOM line. And we were able to get a lot done, and it was done respectfully, and it was done, you know, with actually with in the end of the day with, I think, a fair amount of personal affection for the other person. So that's the ideal, and unfortunately, it doesn't always work that way.
So for those of you who may not have had the opportunity of meeting Lieutenant General John Sattler, who was then the Director for Strategy and Policy on the Joint Staff, and I was Director for Operations, and I'm confident that John would share your sentiments, Ambassador, because it was a very strong partnership. But those things don't happen automatically. I think the sentiment that Greg reflected remains prevalent amongst mid-grade military officers today. There was a time when we were starting to chip away at that perception, and it was forced by the large-scale operations in both Iraq and Afghanistan that forced junior and mid-grade military and civilian folks together, shared hardship, shared missions, collaborative efforts, but it took that kind of large-scale operational force to build that kind of trust. The challenge, I think, is how do you build and sustain that trust absent that the pressure forced by large-scale combat operations? Certainly, the opportunities for shared educational opportunities, SACE is a good example of that, to do that. But the more opportunities we can find at a relatively junior and mid-grade level to put military leaders and civilian leaders together, I think the better off we will be. I'm a product of that. I had really no engagement with any civilian leadership. It was very episodic, really until I was in northern Iraq in Mosul when Ambassador Redelman was in Turkey. That's too late in the development of a military officer to craft that relationship, and frankly, too late in the development of foreign service officers, USAID, mission directors, and others. We have to find ways to build that trust over time, so that in exigent circumstance, the trust is already built.
Kath, I'm going to ambush you with this one. We didn't talk about it, but it just occurred to me listening to the three panelists. So one of those instances where trust seemed to break down was the debate over Afghanistan during the Obama administration in that first year over the surge, where the president felt like he was being gamed or boxed in by the uniformed military, and the uniformed military, I think, felt like they weren't getting an honest hearing from the White House. I'm curious why you think that happened, what the lessons are from it, and is that just the natural friction of the policy process, or is there a better way to do it?
I think some of it is, I would say, maybe understandable friction, but so I saw that play out in the Afghanistan debate, and then given that debate left a bad taste in both sets of actors, then you saw it play out again in a number of other instances, Syria, Libya, you name it. So I think the reality is you're going to have that kind of friction. The problem is when you focus too much on that friction and the distrust it creates and not on how you build out better solutions and answers in each instance that it happens. So in other words, if you can get at the incentive structures of why do people feel they need to game, and try to get honest hearings, and that does require probably first and foremost, I think, the civilians to come forward to make clear that they're there with both an understanding, so it's harder to game them. I mean, that's one piece, is the expertise civilians bring that actually can demonstrate that they have enough knowledge that they can't be gamed, but also enough knowledge that maybe you could trust them with the real facts. And then for the military to sort of, understand that it is essentially out of their hands at the end of the day, that major decision-making use of force choice. What they can do is best inform the process to their professional requirements and to their professional judgment. I think having that sort of sense of professionalism on both sides is very important. But I completely agree with you. That is a great case where you saw already building on some distrust that hung over from the Iraq War forward. You saw yet again, if you will, a case in which civilians and military were sort of jostling around each other to get to the preferred solution each wanted.
Greg, I'd like to pick up on some of what Kath said. I think this actually goes back before the Obama administration. I think it goes back quite a while, actually. And I think I'd like to make a couple of observations. One is, as Kath was saying, look, there's an inherent tension between what civilians bring to the table and what our military colleagues bring to the table. That's natural, given the different experiential base they bring and the different responsibilities they bear. As long as that tension is managed in a kind of healthy way with open debate and discussion, and then decisions made at the end of it, I think that's fine. But I think the breakdown of our political process, which has been a progressive fact over the last, I would say, 40 or 50 years, has really contributed to a damaging element being entered into this civil-military tension that always exists. And that is, and I saw this happen because for my sins, I lived through the Bush 41 Clinton transition and the Clinton Bush 43 transition, and then the 43 Obama transition. And there is a disturbing tendency, particularly for political appointees who come in, to see, and we certainly saw it, I saw that happen in the Clinton transition from Bush, that the general officers were somehow suspect because they had worked for a different group of civilian masters in the previous administration, and people started talking about Bush generals or Clinton generals and then Bush generals again. And I think that has brought a very poisonous dimension to this. So I think on the civilian side, that is a difficulty and a problem. On the military side, I think there has been an understandable frustration that since the Second World War, which ended with unconditional surrender and very clear outcomes, our military engagements around the world have tended to be much more ambiguous in their outcomes and with much less clarity about, in some cases, even the success of it. Now, I mean, I would argue that the Korean War was actually a great success. If you look at it in the long pull of history, what happened, where the Republic of Korea ended up from where it was in the early 1950s, I think is a tribute to what the United States accomplished. I don't think that was the prevailing view, in the military or in the political class, for that matter, in the mid-1950s and 1960s. And so you get this phenomenon. I think General Powell, expressed this, I think, with the Powell Doctrine, give us a clear mission, and let us use enough force, and then we will accomplish it. And I think that has been part of the problem, because once, military force is applied, once you step off the line, you don't know exactly where this is all going to go. and it's impossible to predict. And policymakers have no better idea than the military does. And my distinguished predecessor, several times removed as Undersecretary Freddie Clay, wrote a book which stuck with me a lot, which is Every War Must End, in which he argues that the exertion of government actually getting into war is so all-consuming that more often than not, it crowds out careful consideration of the ends, in part because it's very hard to do, because you don't know what the end's going to be, but just because basically bandwidth, people just don't have the ability to do that. And I think understanding that is probably a healthy starting point for people on both the civilian and the military sides to start from.
Carter, can I ask you with regard to the Afghanistan debate? I don't know if you were at AFRICOM at the time or if you were still elsewhere in the beginning of the Obama administration. It did strike me that in that particular case, there was some, as Eric noted, there was probably some distrust of the General Officer Corps, which had served under the president. It also struck me that the military came into that debate with a very clear idea, based on their Iraq experience, of exactly what they thought was needed in terms of resources, and it was hard to move them off that. And so I guess my question is, to what extent was the military somewhat at fault for that breakdown in the relationship or the strain on that relationship, and what was a better way for the military to have approached that problem set?
Yeah, so I was at United States Army European Command's Army Service Component when this was playing out. But I think that, Greg, the point is, the sentiment that you expressed at the start, that the prevailing military view is, give us a mission and get out of our way, is just, and it is always the fault of those damn civilians. And I would argue, I think that certainly I, and when I was in service, and other senior military leaders bear at least equal responsibility for this relationship. We have a tendency, it's just recognizing the environment in which one is working. And while there are, on the civilian side, there are national security professionals who come in and out of government, two of whom are up here on this panel. Many folks who come into policy-making positions in various administrations don't have the same background and experience or education. And I think all too often the military says, well, they're just, they're politicals, and they're almost in a derogatory manner, rather than saying, this is the person who is in this job. They have the legal positional authority, and part of my job, and this is something I thought John Sattler and his team did particularly well on the Joint Staff, was to take the time with the civilian counterparts and say, when you say, I want a carrier battle group someplace, here's what that means, and here's why it can't be there tomorrow. And so I think there's a significant shared responsibility that the military must assume in education, informing, and recognizing that in almost every circumstance, the United States military, as good as it is, will almost always be a supporting component of an overarching strategy or campaign. Essential to be sure, but unlikely that the military will be decisive.
How educated were the civilians you were interacting with at the policy level? Did they know what a carrier battle group brought, or what a brigade brought, or were you finding that you needed to educate folks on that?
Well, there was always education, but so does the military. To say, what's an OFTA team? What is that, and what capabilities do they bring? What capabilities can the Department of Treasury bring to bear, or the DEA, or Homeland Security? So it's very much a shared responsibility. Lots of learning opportunities on both sides. It's one of the reasons why I think the opportunities to put military leaders and civilian leaders together in in various educational experiences, I think that simply cannot be overstated.
Just wanted to add one thing to your first question, which Carter had come back to in the description of the lieutenant colonel, who comes out and says, just give us the guidance. If you live at whatever the command level is for long enough, and your job is to provide guidance, and in my case it was an OSD, like many of the folks I can see in the room, you learn over time that the reality is that the real refrain is, give me guidance, no, not that guidance. So it is a natural friction that plays out in any hierarchical system. It's just that in this hierarchical system, it's also layered across civilian and military, because that is the constitutionally based choice we have made. And yet, we don't recognize that both as inherent. We make it a civ-mil thing, and sometimes it is, but that ladens it, if you will, and brings on this sense that it's a civ-mil issue. And then I would also say we really are wildly underinvested in that civilian training component. If we want to have as a key feature of our democracy that we're going to have civilian control of the military, it's sort of shocking that it takes teaching yourself, if you will, how to work through the system, rather than a more institutionalized structure and investment that we make as a nation in civilians learning about the military.
Where should that occur? Is it at a place like SICE? Does the
Sure.
government have some responsibility?
Sure. I think
to
the
do
government should give a lot of money to Mara Carlin here at SICE to run programs. Absolutely, yeah. I do. I think a lot of it can be done in educational institutions. It can be done through the standing professional military education institutions that we have, creating slots specifically designed for this. And to pick up on Carter's point, particularly if you can put the military and civilian together in those sort of learning environments at early stages of their career. But we do very little of that, frankly, given the value we put on it for this country.
Well, I think, Kath, I'd be interested if you agree with this, but I think there's a bit of we have an imbalance that exists, or an asymmetry between the military and the civilian component in the Department of Defense, which is that the military, and I say this in total admiration, has put a lot of effort into professional military education, and of course training, and we just don't do that for the civilians on the OSD side. And in particular, those who are the national security professionals who are not in and outers, as Carter was saying, but who are part of the permanent staff. I mean, what struck me as an interloper from the State Department into defense was it was hard to see what the career progression was of a GS professional in OSD policy. And really, talented and capable folks like Kath, who already had a PhD, could go out and establish themselves in the think tank and then come back in at a more senior level. But that wasn't really open to everyone. And we took some steps while I was there, and I know others have broken their pick on trying to fix this, but I don't think we have fixed it, and we need to figure out a way to do that, to kind of level the playing field a little bit.
Some of it is structural, right? I mean, the armed forces have an overhead that allows the armed services to pull officers out and send them to these professional military education programs without leaving a hole in an operational unit. I believe almost all, if not all, the civilian agencies of the U.S. government don't enjoy it. So if you take a foreign service officer and send her to the National Defense University, there's a hole someplace in the State Department that is not being filled. And so, I think, again, there's a bit of a structural imbalance here as well.
The other structural imbalance that struck me just as an observer of the Pentagon is the combatant commands and the joint staff have these big, very robust staffs that the civilians don't have, and that are very well trained and exceedingly efficient, if not always effective. And so I wonder what kind of friction that creates in the policy process. What kind of imbalances does that create?
Significant. Where to pick this thread up. I think one that always stands out to me, and Carter having been a combatant commander and Eric having been an ambassador, maybe this will resonate, is the view that, you know, if you're an assistant secretary of state, you don't have a plane. If you're a combatant commander, you have a plane available to travel through your region. You know, these are simple seeming and really just anecdotes, but they get to this bigger issue of who really is best resourced to represent the United States in its various ways that we do so, including overseas. And the military is, as Carter said, structurally advantaged, and it's advantaged structurally in part because we have decided as a nation to resource it better than we choose to resource other instruments of national security power.
So when I came into OSD as undersecretary, having just left, you know, my mission in Ankara, I remember getting briefed by all the different components of OSD policy. And the question I asked everybody who came in to brief me, okay, tell me about, you know, the personnel structure of your office, you know, like how many, you know, FTEs, how many full-time employees do you have? And it was always, and you know, this is just kind of notional, but it was, well, we got 3 FTEs and we've got 1 IPA, you know, who's on loan from you know, a university. We've got 2 contractors and a bunch of interns. And I mean, literally got the sense as I, you know, began to understand what the organization in being looked like of a place that was being held together by paper clips and Band-Aids and you know, and bubble gum, as opposed to the joint staff, you know, which had, you know, a very large, very capable staff, which then was augmented, became even larger with the dissolution of JIFCOM.
Joint forces,
Mm-hmm. That's, I think, another, you know, sort of imbalance, which is that the personnel structure of a lot of the offices in OSD policy are unstable and you know, kind of groaning under you know, overwork, including you know, enormous amount of work that is created by the Congress with mandated reports that have to be you know, provided to the Congress you know, on a schedule.
I was very fortunate at United States Africa Command to be in a command that when it was birthed had a bit of a different view of how the organization would be stood up, and Colonel Retired Randy White was there with me, and we had not a huge number, but a larger percentage of staff who came from departments other than the Department of Defense, and that was tremendous value added to a new combatant command, a young combatant command, particularly one operating in an area where the U.S. military did not have much resident expertise other than the extraordinary cohort of attachés and security cooperation officials. So we were deeply reliant on those foreign service officers, on those aid mission directors and the folks from the other departments, agriculture, health and human services, DEA, and many others, to give us not only functional expertise from whence they came, but regional understanding. And so a sprinkling, and it really wasn't more than that, but a sprinkling of civilian expertise inside that military formation made tremendous difference.
Can I ask another contributor to the imbalance? I think in the current administration came in and sort of concluded that the civilians in the White House in particular were too controlling of military operations. They were dictating too much and have ceded operational control, more operational control to the military in places like Syria. I think we saw it in the Niger mission. And I guess I'm curious, in what ways has that been a good thing from your all's perspective? In what cases has it been a bad thing? Did they overcorrect, correct just the right amount?
I think I'm starting again.
Yeah, we'll work down the line.
We'll work down the line. I completely agree with you. I think you've seen some pendulum swinging of over-centralization and risk, extreme you know, risk calculus views inside at the end of the Obama administration. Well, close to the end. They started to loosen up, actually, in their last year or so there on some areas. So, for instance, in the South China Sea and in Syria, you saw that. But I do think there was a general perspective, and certainly inside the military, in the uniform side, that it was much too centralized in terms of control over operational matters, which commanders on the ground felt were hamstringing their ability to achieve objectives given to them by the White House. What you have seen since, I think in some areas, I've been happy with it from what I can see from the outside, and I would include in that the loosening of rules of engagement in Syria, that I think were done to an appropriate level, and there is still an ability for, the strictures of civilian control are still there, but there was more operational responsibility shifted downward. I think in cyberspace, I'd say the same thing, although I don't know what I don't see there, so that's a concern. But I do think we have seen cases where the lack of civilian oversight has been problematic. I think the case of Niger is complicated by the fact that actually the civilians were told for some time what was going on but weren't paying attention to it. But you could definitely see where the military chain of command at some level broke down, and there was operational action on the ground that had strategic consequences for the United States in terms of how this sort of blew back, and of course the death of American service members. And I think the other case, probably little noticed, I would point to was the case in April of 2017, I think, where the US aircraft carrier, according to President Trump, had been ordered toward Korea as part of the Fire and Fury campaign and was found photographed near Indonesia. And that apparently was a miscommunication. That's kind of a problem. I mean, as somebody who oversaw efforts on war planning and contingency planning, assuming that was not a purposeful deception, which there was no indication that it was, that's a major problem if the civilian leadership thinks it has an aircraft carrier in the region and it's in fact 3,000 miles away. So I think there are problems for sure when you have a case of the operational and the strategic coming apart. And that's something I am continuing to be concerned about. That said, under the current administration, I'm not sure, that tight centralization in the White House, given my particular viewpoints, is exactly what I want to see with regard to the use of military forces. But I do think we need to maintain, for purposes of our democracy, a strong civilian control mechanism.
I think there's a distinction, Greg, between operations in an active zone of combat and elsewhere. In a declared active zone of combat, commanders should have, I think, pretty wide latitude to exercise their command prerogatives, again, within a set of frameworks. Outside of active zones of combat, the civilian oversight, it was challenging, to be sure. I'm not sure that we want it otherwise. And again, in my time at Africa Command, there were times when I would propose a strike against a terrorist individual or cell that presented a threat. That was a very detailed and rigorous process to ultimately get to, you have the authority to do this or you don't. I don't think that's a bad thing. If we're going to use the power of the nation to kill someone outside of an active zone of combat, that should be a pretty high bar. It was painful to go through that process, but I think it was appropriate.
Can I ask you, it's interesting, so on kinetic strikes, there's a very detailed back and forth. On a training mission, like the training mission in Niger, where it seemed like, and I don't know if they were being disingenuous, but that the White House and Congress didn't know exactly what we were doing there or why. How frustrating was it, or how hard did you have to push to get people's attention to say, please pay attention to what I'm doing here?
It was a challenge in where the U.S. military operates, engages in lots of different ways, in small groups and large, in far reaches of the globe, most of which is outside of the public view, and frankly, most of which is outside of the interest level of the administration and of the Congress. I only know what's been publicly releasable. I'm kind of where Dr. Hicks is to say, the information was there. It was available. Did folks pay attention to it? I think it's hard to tell. But the scale of operations of the U.S. military on a daily basis is such. I mean, there are always thousands and thousands of American military personnel in harm's way outside of active combat zones. It's just the nature of what military activities are. And so I think the department has a responsibility to report and say, we're doing these types of engagements and exercises and operations. But I don't know, other than the tragedy such as occurred in Niger, that you break through the level of interest at some levels, particularly at Congress.
I think this is fundamentally a kind of Goldilocks problem, which you see it in every administration. To defend the Trump administration, which, as many of you know, I'm not want to do, it wasn't just the Trump administration that came in and concluded that there had been over-centralization in the White House. I invite your attention to a panel discussion a couple of years back at the Reagan Defense Forum that Bob Gates and Leon Panetta had, in which they were very vocal about the degree to which they thought the White House had improperly centralized oversight of military operations. So it was not just a Trump administration point of view. I recall very distinctly at the beginning of the Bush 43 administration, and President Bush was somebody who definitely did not want to be Lyndon Johnson. I remember, Dr. Cohen's not here, but I remember he had a conversation with Elliott about Supreme Command and said, I've read your book and I don't want to be Lyndon Johnson picking aim points in the sit room. But I recall early in the administration when he was having a press conference with then President Fox of Mexico, I think it was. And in the middle of the press conference, we had a U.S. aircraft that was involved in Northern Watch shot at by the Iraqis, which kind of disrupted the press conference, which made the president say, I want to know about this stuff when it's going on, because these kinds of military operations can have sort of political consequences. I remember, I don't remember whether you were there or not, Carter, but I remember going into the Oval to brief President Bush on a particular mission, which the then director of the Joint Staff, who came in with me, Stan McChrystal, I don't know, were you there in that?
I was already in Europe.
Okay, so Stan, we briefed the president on this mission, and it was going to be very low observability, no chance that it was going to become public. There was no problem really with this mission, just wanted to inform him and let him know. That's not how it went down, and it became a big issue with the host government and in the news, and we had to go back in very sheepishly and have the President of the United States say, low observables, no chance of becoming public. And so, look, the President has equities when military is involved. It makes sense for people to understand that. You're never going to get it perfectly right. You just have to try and find a balance, and every administration, in my experience, ultimately does find some modus vivendi or some balance. I mean, it's not too much or too little. I mean, you want to try and get it kind of just right, but getting it just right is not that easy.
I was going to ask a little bit about the Mattis resignation letter. He's not a general officer, but we tend to think of him that way. Is there an assumption that as he wrote that letter to President Trump that he was speaking for the general officer corps? What impact will his departure have on civil-military relations? And was he correct to make that letter public?
So Kath and I disagree on this, so I'll start. Knowing General Mattis, I don't think he had any presumption that he was speaking for anyone other than himself. I don't think there was any sense that he was conveying a sense of the United States military or of the senior leadership when he submitted his letter. I admired Jim Mattis. I've known him for a long time, worked side by side with him, and think he was a superb Secretary of Defense. I wish he had not made that letter public. I wish he had had that conversation with the President in private to say, Mr. President, you need a Secretary of Defense who is more aligned with you. It's time for me to go. And I think having left it at that, the public statement should have, I think, in my view, would have been best if just it's time. You know, it's been here for 2 years. It's time for me to return to the private sector. Not an uncommon occurrence in this city. And I think but the way that it played out, unfortunately, it became very political very quickly, and I think that's unfortunate. I think it's unfortunate for the man, and I think it's unfortunate for the nation.
Do you guys agree? Public, not public?
I'm going to let Kath go first, because I'm afraid I'm going to be uncharacteristically wishy-washy on this one.
I think he resigned on principle, and it was perfectly appropriate to issue the letter, particularly in the current environment where you won't have a voice. I mean, that is not the environment that the president allows. And in fact, the president didn't allow it. He then sort of scooped in and reframed it as a political issue, you know, calling Secretary Mattis a Democrat. But the letter doesn't convey that. You know, the president was going to take that. He was going to take the strategic communication hill he wanted to take. But I think Secretary Mattis appropriately laid out his viewpoint. As I have told Carter, I would have preferred him to go a little further in his letter. So I'm definitely on the other side of Carter on this, because I think the times demand it, and I think his experience, even that the pieces we all saw, which I can only imagine is a small percent of the actual experience, made clear that there was probably much more to be said, and maybe to Carter's point, we should actually applaud him in some level for the professionalism to stop where he did. You did ask about what his legacy is with regard to civil-military relations, and I don't think it's a good one. I think Secretary Mattis is a human. I think sometimes people either make him a saint or they make him a villain. He's a human. He had, you know, limitations like all humans when he came in, and we saw some of those play out. And part of that is he had a 40-plus year military career in the Marine Corps, and we saw him play to that in terms of his staffing, in terms of what made him comfortable, in terms of deference to military viewpoints. I was one of two people alongside Elliot Cohen who testified to the Senate in favor of allowing a vote on a waiver for Secretary of Defense who was a general officer, and I stand by that. But part of what I said in that testimony was he has to go the extra mile. If you're a retired military officer, you have to go out of your way to demonstrate that you are taking into account civilian viewpoints, that you are not looking to your known network of, in this case, Marines, but looking to a very broad range of civilians and others for their input, talking to all kinds of people from different backgrounds, and we didn't see that. Again, I don't demonize him for it. I'm quite certain that Jim Mattis served his country pretty darn well as Secretary of Defense, but I think on civil-military relations, it didn't go all that well.
You know, I think the comments that both Carter and Kath have made are, in a way, testimony to the fact that we're dealing with a very rare occurrence here with Secretary Mattis's resignation, which is unlike the UK, for instance, where resignation of cabinet ministers on principle is actually quite relatively common. And just think of what's gone on in Britain in the last 3 years over Brexit and the number of cabinet resignations that there have been is, you know, proof, I think, of that. In the US, it's been historically very rare for a cabinet, you know, secretary to resign over principle. And so on the one hand, I have some sympathy for Carter's point of view about why it may not have been the wisest course to publish. But I also, I think, fundamentally agree in the end of the day with Kath that we're not in normal times. and I don't think it's a good thing to pretend we're in normal times under this president. And because resignation in principle is so rare in our system, I think it probably did merit, a public hearing. I once remonstrated with Secretary Gates that, his memoir account, which has some very unflattering stuff about President Obama in it. Now, of course, bear in mind, full disclosure, I spent the better part of 2011 and 2012 trying to help elect Mitt Romney, so it's not like I don't have a dog in this fight. But, I thought he really owed it in some sense to the American people if he was going to make those criticisms, to do it have the book come out before the election, when it might have informed the public and allowed them to make a better informed choice. So I hear both sides of the argument. I think in the end of the day, I'm inclined to Kath's side.
Can I ask Eric and Kath, if he were still in uniform, this is a hypothetical, if he were chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had the same concerns and resigned, would a public letter have been appropriate? Or in that case, if he's still in uniform as the chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, inappropriate?
I think it would have been far less appropriate. I could imagine circumstances where I would find that legitimate, appropriate, what have you. But I think the standard would be much higher.
My view is it would be inappropriate unless he was resigning over an illegal order.
Right.
In which case it would be fully appropriate. But I think it really is there is a big difference, and that is that, that it really goes to civilian control of the military. The president is ultimately the decider in chief. If the chairman of the Joint Chiefs decides that he has a political or policy problem with the president, then, president wins. The Secretary of Defense, it's a more ambiguous and more complicated, I think, calculus.
Yeah, I think that's right. The oath that military officers take requires them to be supportive of the decisions. Those who have served, every one of us has received an order that we disagreed with, that we recommended against, and then the appropriate authority makes a decision, and you either put your full mind and body and energy into fulfilling that order, or in my view, you must resign, because you cannot then fulfill your duty. I think a public resignation by a serving military officer over a policy matter would only serve to further politicize the officer corps, and I think that would be most unhelpful to the nation.
Carter, can I ask on that score about the border mission? General Dunford's standard, at least publicly, is that if it's a lawful order, it's our job to execute the lawful orders. This is a lawful order. Is that right? What are his obligations when asked by the press about this mission, when asked by Congress whether it's an appropriate use of military force? Should he worry that using the military on such a politicized mission discredits the uniformed military in some way?
I don't think it discredits the uniformed military at all to fulfill the lawful orders that they have been given. I suspect, knowing General Dunford, when I was the director for operations, he was the vice director. So we had a very close relationship and have for a number of years. I'm very confident that General Dunford laid out for the Secretary of Defense, for the President, and for others. Here are the implications of such a deployment. Here's what it will, these are what these units would be doing otherwise if they were not deployed to this border mission. Here are the costs attendant to that. Here are the impacts that will have on readiness and other missions. And I think that's the rightful role of the senior military advisor to the commander-in-chief, is to lay out those parameters to say, what you have proposed is this, and here's how we would do it, and here are the risks and the costs and the implications inherent in that decision. But what would we expect? We expect the uniformed military to say no to a lawful order? I mean, that puts us on a pretty bad path.
Does he have a obligation to say, I think this is a poor or inefficient use of military powers?
So, Greg, I think the answer to your question is the following, which is, I agree with Carter, which is that if it's a lawful order, chairman is, should say, we'll execute that order. The chairman also, like all of us who are confirmed by the Senate Armed Services, or have been confirmed by the Senate Armed Services Committee, has promised to provide their own opinion of best military advice or defense advice to the Congress when called upon to testify, even if it disagrees with administration policy. And in answer to questions from members of Congress exercising their constitutional oversight responsibilities, that's the place where it perfectly would be appropriate for the chairman to lay out how this might divert funding from training or other military construction needs that the military has prioritized in a way that is, honest, direct, and maybe politically inconvenient for the president and the administration, but within, I think, the scope of his responsibilities and undertakings.
I'll just offer you a personal example. In 2012, and some of you will remember back in the issue of Joseph Kony and the Lord's Resistance Army operating in Central Africa. And this kind of got some public notice, and at some point there was a discussion about what should the U.S. military do about it. My recommendation as the combatant commander at the time was that, I understand we have some tools and capabilities that might be useful in this regard, but the reality is Joseph Kony and the Lord's Resistance Army, as abhorrent as they are, do not present a threat to the United States of America. We have other more critical threats, and that's what we should be using our assets for. That debate ensued, and ultimately the decision was made. We're going to use military force in the effort to counter Joseph Kony and the Lord's Resistance Army. And so you say, okay. I had my say, I made my recommendations, I said, here's the impact, and at some point, the appropriate authority said, thanks for your contributions to national security, do this. And you go do that. That's how our system works, and it's perhaps what's the old Churchill saying, the worst possible form of government except for all the others. Maybe that's kind of where we are.
I agree with what's been said. It may just be a quirky point, but I just want to point out the chairman's not in the chain of operational command, and thus it is only his advice that is relevant to the conversation around the employment of forces on the border. That is a direction that goes from the president to the secretary to NORTHCOM. And so you have seen General O'Shaughnessy, the commander of NORTHCOM, testify just this past week that he does not believe there's an emergency at the border, and he has both provided his advice and is executing the lawful orders, and I agree it's a lawful order.
Kath, should we worry, or am I clutching at pearls here, that having the military in body armor on the border executing this mission to create the impression that there's an emergency, does that politicize the military in a way that concerns you at all, or do we sophisticated enough to understand the difference between the military and the civilian?
I worry about it. I don't think it's the military's burden to bear. It's a political challenge for sure. That's, I think, being borne out every day in the debate in Washington. It's not the first, I do not believe we should have troops on the border, please believe me, but it is not the first time we have done it. We did it under Obama, and I am very aware and conscious, having been there at the time that we did it. And I understand, and in 43, and I understand it is highly politicized right now, but it is not because of the troops, if you will. It's politicized because it's being placed inside this broader, polarized, toxic immigration debate inside the United States. And so, as I think Carter said, well, what do you expect the military to do? They have been given a lawful order. It is not an unprecedented order. They are executing that to the best of their ability. To the degree that we can take them out of the equation and turn the cameras on Washington, maybe, and away from the border, I think that makes a lot of difference, and I think working the other pieces of this problem set, separated children, all that, that is, I think, the much bigger piece of it. But I think the key for them is the discipline to not, for instance, shoot at the border. We have had that happen before, not in this administration, with a Marine. Those are the sorts of things I think we should be focused on in the military piece of this, which is let's keep them focused on the mission that they have. Let's make sure that the use of force rules of engagement are very clear and even risk averse. And let's fix ourselves here in Washington.
Eric, I wanted to ask a Secretary of Defense question. So we've gone from 180 degrees from General Mattis, who was very sort of policy and had a deep background in sort of deep operational background in terms of the employment of military force over the course of 40 years, to an acting Secretary of Defense and Secretary Shanahan. Let's play a hypothetical and assume he becomes the Secretary of Defense, who has almost no operational policy background, career in the defense industry. How does that complicate the Civ-Mil relationship?
Actually, one of the reservations I have about Secretary Shanahan is that the bulk of his career in aviation was actually on the commercial side and not on the defense side. I mean, he had a year plus or so on working on missile defense for Boeing, but he does not have a deep background in defense industry, which I think is a bit of a problem. And he has zero policy background. So to me, I mean, we'll see how Senator Inhofe reacts if there's a nomination. He's on the record as saying he has reservations about Secretary Shanahan being put up to be the permanent nominee for Secretary of Defense. I mean, we'll have to see how that plays out. But if I were a member of the committee, I think, which is probably the best way to answer that question, I would have a lot of questions of this nominee and about their ability to fill this role.
Let's assume he's...
So if I could harken back to a comment that Dr. Hicks made about Secretary Mattis. You know, the Department of Defense, as you both know, is just such an expansive enterprise. You're never going to have a secretary who has mastery of the entire enterprise. So secretaries come in with certain areas of expertise, and then what we should hope for is that then they will build a team that can help them in the areas that they may not have great experience. And I think that's the most important thing to look forward to. And I do hope that there is there's value in there's great value in having a confirmed Secretary of Defense, whether that's Secretary Shanahan or anyone else. There's a message to the force, it's a message to the nation, that this is the president's nominee confirmed by the Senate to perform this absolutely essential function. So I think that's the start point.
And I agree with that. I think that is important. I think it would be very unfortunate if, as the president has suggested, he might be willing to go for a very long period with an acting secretary. I mean, I think there are legal issues with that, about the Vacancy Act, et cetera. But I think there are, other questions that are raised that Carter just, articulated.
I'm going to ask one more question here to Kath, and then I want to throw it open to you guys on the question of Shanahan. How does having a Secretary of Defense with no policy experience affect the Civ-Mil balance? What pressures does it put on General Dunford and then his successor, General Milley, as they negotiate the Civ-Mil relationship?
Yeah, I mean, experience isn't everything. I think the key is on any given individual, in this case Shanahan, do they listen? Do they have a good judgment? Do they have independence and sort of a strong moral fiber with regard to their role as the Secretary of Defense, one of two members with the President of National Command Authority? That's an immense responsibility, and so that's what I would be looking for more than anything. It's such an immense responsibility that it needs to be Senate confirmed. And there needs to be a conversation, not just the confirmation itself, but the conversations as part of that confirmation process with Hill leadership, so that Article 1 of the Constitution is actually respected in this, the role of Congress in the employment, use, funding of military forces. That conversation needs to be happening. And to the extent that you don't confirm someone It's a problem inside the department for all the reasons that were said. It's a problem for the American people because their representatives in Congress are not able to have that role that's appropriate to how we think about the use of force. I don't have strong views on Shanahan himself. I think we're going to see with this 2020 budget rollout the degree to which his projection of a masterpiece of shifting the department toward the challenges of the future is fulfilled or not. He's been doing some press lately indicating he thinks we will be impressed by that. He's done some foreign travel that I think we're going to see and meetings in town with foreign officials. I think understanding how he's doing in terms of those issues of policy judgment, listening, advancing the goals of the American people in terms of alliances and partnerships, that will be very important. But I'd like to get him or whoever the nominee is up in front of the Senate Armed Services Committee as soon as possible.
Great. I'll throw it up into the crowd for a bit. Go right ahead.
That's coming.
I'm sorry about that. I should have given you guys a little bit of a heads up.
Hi, Sheikh Katiri, first-year student, strategic studies. My question is how, regardless of the merits of policy, how do you rate the previous and current administration's handling of lifting the ban of transgender service and then putting the ban on again without any oversight from Congress?
Yeah. I can start
So,
if you like, but I think people know what I think.
Yeah. So I carry some baggage on this, having co-chaired the department study of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, though transgender was excluded from that study because it was not addressed in the law. I think the service chiefs in testimony before Congress have been pretty clear that they have seen no negative operational impact. And I think that's the right question. The right question, regardless of who it is that's being considered for military service, do they bring operational capability to the military force? That's the question. And if those who can, as the service chiefs have stated, if people who can be value added to the military, be operational capabilities that the military needs, I think the chiefs have said it pretty succinctly.
Great, we'll go right over here real quick. I think there's a mic coming right around to you.
Bruce Creedy, I'm a master's student at Georgetown and a member of the U.S. Navy. My question, you referred earlier to an earlier point in your career where you said a place where the military didn't have a big presence, how you relied on FSOs and attachés. Following Rex Tillerson's term, what do you think it will be the effect on and how they kind of cut down on the State Department? What do you think the effect will be on the military?
Yeah, I think, certainly beginning with Secretary Gates, continuing with Secretary Panetta, I think Secretary Hagel and Secretary Carter's succession of secretaries of defense have echoed the sentiment, that the foreign policy of the United States is administered by the State Department. And, the quip from General Mattis, if you don't resource the State Department, you better buy me more ammunition. There's some truth there. I think you will find broadly across the United States military tremendous support for investing in the non-military components of our government that advance United States interests diplomatically, economically, informationally, culturally. Inside the uniformed military, I think those investments are worthy investments over time.
Great.
I think speaking for the State Department side of it, I think Secretary Tillerson's justifiably abbreviated reign was catastrophic for the diplomatic capability of the United States. And I say that not because it affected me personally. I mean, I and my age cohort, we have mandatory retirement for age in the Foreign Service at 65. So my age cohort has, already aged out. But what disturbs me is the very large group of folks in the 15 to 65-year-old age group who have left in part as a result of Tillerson's management of the department. And that is going to take a very long time to recover from, because those are people who the nation has invested, in most cases, 20 years, 25 years into their professional training. They were just arriving at the point that they were in positions of senior leadership and prepared to take the most senior positions of leadership available in the Department of State. And that's not something that you can recover from by saying, well, we're just going to promote the younger people, the 45-year-olds, into those positions, because they have not had the 10 or 15 years of additional experience that matters, I think, in managing those positions. So I think it's going to take 15 or 20 years to recover from the damage that Tillerson has done.
Great. Let's do the woman in blue right here with the scarf.
Hi, Sasha Kishanchand. I'm a SAIS alum, Strategic Studies, 2000. I'm that old. And so my question is generated by my work in Syria. Well, I was actually based in Turkey in 2017, and it was under state NEA. Now that we've been talking for months about our military withdrawal or drawdown in Syria, I think the general public may not understand that that does not necessarily mean complete disengagement, because there's a huge civilian effort there, and I think this applies to other places we're engaged. When I was in Afghanistan 2012, though, my Afghan staff's perception, because we were talking about military drawdown there, they said when the military goes, the money goes. I was wondering if you can address that and if that's accurate in my perception. I don't think so, but I could be wrong.
I don't have a good answer to that, and particularly in that particular case. I think it's fair to say that a lot of the funding, even if it's under authorities executed by state in the, I'm using post-conflict very generically, given that it's Syria and we're not post anything, that money is coming from DOD. So I think that is a question. Will DOD keep funding, even if the authorities are, and the execution is done through state or state contractors? And I don't know.
And in my experience, and in particular, I would say post-Benghazi, I think state is going to be extremely risk-averse in keeping people in the field without the military umbrella enabling capabilities that the military brings to that diplomatic and stabilization effort.
I was going to ask, on that same score, in Iraq, as we draw down the military and hand that mission over to state, this was during the Obama administration. What were the weaknesses of that handover? What does that tell us, if anything, about the civil-military relationship?
Oh, where to begin? The idea was normalization, right? That was the operative word used. The idea that we had finished the conflict phase and we're moving into a normalized embassy footprint. And I think that in that turnover, there was a dismissal. Maybe that's a little strong, but I'll still stick by it. A dismissal of views that there were ongoing security concerns, which of course ended up proving out when ISIS rolled across the border uncontested. So I think what you saw there was, unfortunately, all too common, where agencies sort of shift responsibility from one to another as though there's hard lines and lanes, and in that case, DOD, not because the military wanted to, but because it was directed to, moved on in many ways. And on the state side, they have a template for that. It's how a normal embassy works and how one should both staff it and what its functions should be. And I think what was missed in that, and clearly in the larger intel picture, was what was happening on the ground in Iraq in and around that should have been shaping how we staffed our approach to Iraq in that period.
And I wasn't in government at the time, so Kath can correct me if I'm wrong,
No,
but
I was also out.
but my recollection is
Yeah.
that there were, state had very ambitious plans for a very large embassy presence that was going to cost upward of, a couple of $1 billion. And that money just, once the military left, was just not forthcoming from the Congress. There was just no way they were going to get it.
Great. Was you right here in the black sweater?
Hi, Leah Dreyfus, Strat alum of last year, former student of Professor Edelman's, currently at Brookings. I'm wondering if you have any particular thoughts on the role veterans can play in bridging the civ-mil divide. We've talked largely about the split sort of simultaneously sort of across communities, but given their potential for transition and their obvious ethos of service, I'm wondering if you had any thoughts in that particular realm.
Sure, I'll start. We've talked today mostly about civil-military relationships inside the national security policy-making world and in that community. Another component, I think, of civil-military is the broad one that you address and that several have addressed over time. Of most of America, I think, is genuinely supportive of the armed forces, but they don't know the armed forces. They don't understand the ethos of service that you mentioned. And I think there's an absolutely critical role for veterans to play in businesses, in schools, in local governments across the nation, partly to dispel this absolutely flawed perception that veterans are somehow damaged. And the more that we can do collectively to counter that narrative and celebrate the great capability and service of veterans across the nation in many fields, the more that we can do that and highlight that element of service, I think the better off we will be as a nation.
General Ham remarked earlier this afternoon about the close relationship that developed between a lot of, in particular, Foreign Service personnel with the provincial reconstruction teams in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think that was a very good experience for those FSOs and probably good for the military folks with whom they served. I hope it also sparks among some of the folks who've now left military service an interest in taking the Foreign Service exam and entering the Foreign Service. I think it would be enormously beneficial, in fact, for the Foreign Service and for this whole issue of civil-military relations if that were to take place. I recall very vividly when we were talking about standing up the PRTs in Iraq, that one of the only people in the State Department who had had any experience with anything like this was Ambassador Jeffrey, who's now back in service in government, who had been an Army Ranger in Vietnam and had some recollection of the Accords program and what had gone on. Almost everybody else in the State Department who had had that experience was long gone and retired, which meant that the State Department, as much as the military, had to go back and rediscover the experience of Vietnam that we had had with the civil-military engagement to stabilize provinces in Vietnam, which actually turned out to be very successful. It's a problem that both agencies has had, and I'm hoping that a lot of the vets will enter the State Department. It would be an enormous boon to the country, I think.
And I just layer on, I feel like I have a leitmotif at this point on Congress, but I do think it's always important to think about Congress as a player in the civil-military picture. They're a significant player. Again, Article 1 of the Constitution, power of the purse, war powers. And you see, of course, a freshman class now with a number of veterans inside it. And in addition to that, routinely now, I think you're seeing many more veteran staff members on Capitol Hill. And that's another way in which I think the debate is being somewhat reshaped by the role of veterans.
Great. Let's do the blue sweater in the back there.
Henry Newsom, Central Gulf Lines. Dr. Hicks and Dr. Edelman praised Secretary Mattis and Secretary Gates for their public critique of their presidents shortly following their departures. Presidents always choose between loyalty and integrity when appointing senior officials. Might a wary president choose loyalty too often over integrity if this becomes common practice? McNamara is another example, and how he handled his departure from the Johnson administration and was criticized for 4 decades of silence.
I'm sure every president has to weigh his own personal interest, political interests against the public good in choosing. But cabinet officials have to be Senate confirmed. And again, that is the role of Congress in part, is to ensure the integrity of that process beyond just simple loyalty, but actually ensuring that you have people who are qualified for positions. So I don't have a simple answer to that question, except I suspect that going to loyalty 2 times ill serves people in different ways, and also isn't a foolproof guarantee that loyalty of the moment is loyalty over the time. And I won't give any current examples, but you could probably pull some to mind.
I think it's an interesting corollary to senior retired military officers. You know, what's the appropriate role for senior retired military officers in this dialogue? And we've seen many examples of that. Certainly in the 2016 party conventions, we saw 2 very senior former military officers take very political views. And so I think that's a component, and my personal concern is that when senior retired military folks take those very public, very political stands, it starts to insert this question, it potentially inserts this question for those who are still serving, to say, you know, I better be careful what I say around this general or admiral, because in a couple of years they might be making some public statements about it. So I think there's a responsibility for those of us who held positions of trust in senior ranks of the military I think there's certainly a role we can play, and I'll pick on General Barno, to provide context and understanding. I think that's an appropriate role for senior retired military officers without going into the political dimension, unless you want to run for office. You want to run for office, have at it. But absent that, I think there's a more appropriate role for those of us who held those positions.
The question's a good one, and I have some sympathy, I think, for the thought behind it, which is, are you driving presidents away from picking people of integrity because they're going to prioritize loyalty, which politicians, have a tendency to do in any event. So I think that's already a looming problem. But again, I think we have to remember that, if we were talking about this in normal times, I might feel one way about it, but this is not a normal time. And one of the things that I find among the many things I find very troubling about this president is the way he characterizes, the military. So for a president to talk about my generals. Now, look, he's not the only president who did this. I mean, Lyndon Johnson, when he landed in Honolulu, said to a, anonymous Army lieutenant, said, "Your helicopter is this way, Mr. President." And he said, allegedly, "They're all my helicopters, son." But this is, this is a little bit worrisome to me, because the military takes an oath to the Constitution. The Constitution says that the president's the commander-in-chief, they have to take their orders from him, but their loyalty is to the Constitution ultimately and not to him personally. And the president's confusion of the institutional role and his personal role is worrisome and troubling. And his invocation of "my generals say X," when it's not clear that they've said any such thing, whether it's got to do with LGBT or the crisis on the border, is equally worrying. And so I don't think we're in normal times, and as a result, I think we have to make allowances for it.
Who do you guys think was Mattis's intended audience for that letter?
I personally think it was for history. I don't think it was for a current era audience. I think that's the legacy. He thinks in those terms, and I think he was leaving that as part of how he wanted to be able to have people think about and frame his role in history.
I haven't had an opportunity to talk to Secretary Mattis about it, and I'm loath to impute a motive to him, because I don't know what he had in his mind.
My guess is Congress, for that matter. I think he's concerned about the relationship and the alliances and wanted to protect his flank, perhaps. Eric.
This is unfair.
Oh, no. It's going to be a 401 level question.
Yeah.
And it's
Graduate level question.
no, and it's for Dr. Hicks and Ambassador Edelman. So, you may want to add to it. So, a lot of our students and a lot of junior national security professionals dream of serving in the roles that you two have served in. But then they also wonder, what do they have to add? Right? They've kind of studied really hard in their SICE classes. They've built up the expertise, but they're not sure kind of why are they at that table? What is it that they contribute? Can you tell us a little bit about what you think is sort of unique about what you contribute as a civilian senior policymaker?
Yeah, I mean, I think the knowledge base of international affairs mixed with the knowledge base of how and I'll use the dreaded term interagency, but how all the various tools of power are meant to work together, how they work together, and how I'm going to speak just to the Defense Department experience, how the military and defense components complement or are a party to that completion of foreign policy. That is a civilian or military, if you so train that way, but it's not in the operational art, if you will, for military officers. That's not how we train them in that way. And so civilians, by and large, though not exclusively, are the ones who are bringing that to the table. Hopefully they're also bringing, oh, by the way, an ability to communicate with, let's say, members of Congress who have a very particular way of communicating. They have a way of speaking in a non-militarized way and with hopefully a few fewer acronyms about some of the challenges that are being faced up at the White House level. And they can write, and they can engage, they can take this synthesizing role and put it into a communicative way, orally or written, so that it can influence how a decision maker understands a problem set. That is a beautiful, unique skill set when you see it deployed, and I've seen it deployed by many, many excellent civilians over time, and I assure you no one else is doing that job.
When Secretary Rumsfeld called me in Ankara and said he wanted me to come back and interview with him to possibly take the job of USDP, I was initially both very flattered, of course, and extremely excited. And by the time I got to Washington to actually have the interview with him, I was basically terrified. And not because Rumsfeld could be a fairly intimidating, imposing person, but because I, in the interim, had read both the Title X responsibilities of the job and then the DoD directive that lays out in fuller detail the full range of responsibilities that the USDP had, which ranged from everything from preserving America's qualitative military edge to counterterrorism, counter-narcotics, bilateral defense relationships, arms control, advising the secretary on the war plans, et cetera. I mean, it goes on and on and on. And I looked at this and I thought to myself, how in the hell does any person do this job? I mean, it's an impossible job. Of course, the secretary's job is even more impossible, as is the chairman's job, And so, what you bring ultimately to these jobs is your experience and your judgment. And Kath, I think, may agree with this. If you went around the sit room and at any given meeting and there was a bubble over the head of the participants and it had their IQ, it would be like 132, 125, 140, There would be nobody who was not really relatively intelligent and smart. If you had their emotional intelligence quotient above their heads, however, the variance would be much wider. And so, you know, in the end of the day, it's really judgment that really matters. And really, it's not subject matter expertise that you're, you know, being expected to bring to bear, because nobody can master all of that information. So what it really is have you had a broad enough an education and broad enough of an experience to be able to weigh information and weigh people. I mean, Dean Acheson used to say, I don't count heads in my staff meeting, I weigh them. You know, and your ability to, you know, to make judgments about who you can rely on and who you can let do their job. And the best thing you can do is recruit good people and then get the hell out of their way and let them do their jobs, and don't try and do their jobs for them. And all too often, unfortunately, that doesn't happen.
I'm just thankful those bubbles didn't exist.
Great, let's do, I think we have time for one last quick question. We'll just do right up front here.
Michael Sternfeld, and questions directed to the ambassador. What, if anything, has been done to create the Reserve Corps in the Department of State as we have in DOD? Speaking as a 58-year-old at the time who got recalled to active duty to go to Iraq. But if you're talking about having institutional knowledge, what is DOS doing along those lines, if anything? Thank you.
So now I'm going to confess a dirty little secret of my Foreign Service career, which some of my Foreign Service colleagues here will probably be amazed at. I never served a consular tour in the Department of State. And periodically, you know, you have that student dream, you know, where you show up at a final exam, it's usually math or a language course, and you haven't been in class all semester. In my version of the dream, I frequently show up in my underwear. You know, and you have to take the exam. I have had dreams where I'm recalled to service, you know, because you have to go back and, you know, do that visa issuance tour that you never did, Eric. But then my wife assures me that, no, we can't do that because there's no stop loss in the Foreign Service, so they can't come back and get you now. It's too late. Look, Dan has forgotten more about this than I know, but the reality is we created a position for a coordinator for stabilization affairs in the Department of State. We had a couple of very good people in that job, at least when I was in government, Carlos Pascual and then John Herbst. And there was an effort to sort of set up a kind of civilian reserve for the State Department that would provide an ability to surge capabilities that we lacked as an institution into places like Iraq, like Afghanistan, when we had to stabilize someplace, you know, after a conflict. And as best I can tell, that's completely fallen into desuetude, and I believe the position may have even been abolished.
As an assistant secretary, there's no reserve.
But there we go. But perfect for the State Department. An assistant secretary, but no reserve corps. How typical. The problem I have with this is that, you know, this is going to come up and bite us again in the future, in my view, almost certainly. Our colleague here, Mike Mandelbaum, has written a book called Mission Failure, in which he argues that what we've done in Bosnia and Kosovo and Iraq and Afghanistan was a tremendous overreach by the U.S. We should never have done it. We don't know how to do it. And because of the unsatisfying experiences we've had in all these things, we're never going to do it again. And when we did a book event here at SAIS, I said, I don't think so, Mike, because, you know, to paraphrase Trotsky, you know, you may not be interested in you know, conflict stabilization, but it's interested in you. And, you know, this is going to come up again somewhere. And I don't know where it will happen. You know, the regime in North Korea will collapse. there'll be something else will happen somewhere, and we're going to be called upon to go in and do this again. And the lack of that capability is something that I think we will suffer from.
Great. Well, that's a troubling note to end on, but we'll end there. Thanks very much, guys. That was terrific.
Thank you.
Thank you, our tremendous panelists and fantastic moderation by Greg Jaffe. We will reconvene at 4:45 for our panel with students and faculty.
Yes,
she is.